On October 22, 1962, the world held its collective breath. That evening, U.S. President John F. Kennedy addressed the American people from the Oval Office, revealing that the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from U.S. shores. The world stood on the brink of nuclear war, and the calm tone of Kennedy's words only magnified the danger behind them. But how were the missile sites discovered? And how did the US and the Soviet Union avoid World War III? Just 8 days earlier, on October 14th, American U-2 spy planes had captured photographs of Soviet missile sites that were under construction across Cuba. The missiles were medium and intermediate range, making them capable of striking most of the continental United States with nuclear warheads. At first, the discovery was kept secret, even from U.S. allies. To determine how to respond, Kennedy convened his closest advisors, an informal committee known as ExComm, an acronym for the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Some argued for airstrikes to destroy the missiles before they could become operational. Others, including Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, warned that such an attack could trigger a full-scale war. For nearly a week, the president weighed those options, while Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev denied that any offensive weapons existed in Cuba. Then, on the evening of October 22nd, Kennedy took his decision public. In his somber, carefully worded address, broadcast across television and radio, he announced the presence of the missiles and declared that any nuclear launch from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union itself, demanding a full retaliatory response. Kennedy announced what he called a strict quarantine of the island, where U.S. naval ships would intercept and inspect all Soviet vessels bound for Cuba. He intentionally did not call it a blockade, since that word meant an act of war under international law. Instead, Kennedy used the term quarantine to signal resolve without provocation. It was a delicate balance of firmness and diplomacy. The next few days brought the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. Soviet ships carrying weapons approached the quarantine line while America's fleet waited, ready to enforce it. In Washington, military alert levels rose to DEFCON 2, the highest ever in U.S. history, short of war itself. Across the country, families built bomb shelters, stocked canned goods, and prayed. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools, unsure if they would see another sunrise. Cuba braced for a potential invasion by the United States. The U.S. fortified its base at Cuba's Guantanamo Bay. The unthinkable had suddenly become possible. To help legitimize the quarantine, Kennedy enlisted support and cooperation from the Organization of American States, a forum of independent nations in the Western Hemisphere. The vote, with Cuba absent, was 20-0 in favor of the quarantine. But the Soviets repeatedly denied that they were installing missile bases in Cuba at all. Kennedy sent Adlai Stevenson to confront Soviet officials before the United Nations, using photographic evidence to expose the Soviets' deception. Behind the scenes, both Kennedy and Khrushchev sought a way out. Private messages, back-channel diplomacy, and tense negotiations played out in secret. Each leader faced pressures from hardliners urging him not to back down. Kennedy's brother, U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, warned that a misstep could, quote, set the world on fire, end quote. It was a contest of nerves, with each leader trying to appear unyielding while searching for compromise. Finally, on October 26th, Khrushchev offered a deal wherein the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the United States promised not to invade the island. Kennedy accepted the deal, but hardliners in the Soviet government wanted more. Then, with a compromise looking promising, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba and the pilot killed. U.S. military leaders pushed for war, but Kennedy held firm, continuing to trust that diplomacy was the best option. To defuse the situation, the U.S. sweetened the deal by privately offering to remove its own medium-range Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but not until 6 months later. The Soviets agreed. On October 28th, the Soviet Union publicly announced that it would withdraw its missiles from Cuba. The world exhaled for the first time in days. War had been avoided, not by force, but by restraint. Kennedy's approval ratings soared, but he confided to aides that it was the most harrowing experience of his presidency. For Khrushchev, the crisis marked both a humiliation and a turning point, as he would be ousted from power just 2 years later. In the months that followed, both nations established direct communication through a hotline between Washington, D.C. and Moscow. They also began exploring nuclear test ban treaties. Days earlier, Kennedy had closed that famous October 22nd televised announcement with a message of courage and calm.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom.
For a generation, the Cuban Missile Crisis became the moment when the world truly understood the price of survival. It was a test of leadership, judgment, and human fear. And somehow, against all odds, the world passed. Here are other events that happened today in history. In 794, Japan's emperor moves his country's capital to the new city of Kyoto. In 1775, Peyton Randolph, the first president of the Continental Congress, dies of illness at 54. In 1784, on Kodiak Island, Russia establishes its first permanent settlement in Alaska. In 1797, the first high-altitude parachute jump is made from a hydrogen balloon above Paris. In 1957, the U.S. suffers its first casualties from enemy attack in Vietnam when 13 are wounded. In 2010, the website WikiLeaks releases 400,000 classified U.S. documents. In 2012, Lance Armstrong is formally stripped of his 7 Tour de France titles for PED use. And now it's time for our Today in History quiz. In 1983, terrorist bombings in Beirut, Lebanon killed hundreds of servicemen from the US and which other country? Italy, France, Britain, or Canada? Liked learning about the Cuban Missile Crisis? Then you'll love this one about the Cold War space race and the ousting of Khrushchev. Tap the screen to keep the story going on Today in History.